There are some people the world forgets about before they are gone. Not cruelly, not with intention, just the way a room goes quiet after someone leaves it, the air settling back into itself as if no one was ever there. Eleanor Marsh had spent 55 years being the kind of woman who held things together, who remembered the details, who stayed after the bell rang when a child needed her to. And somewhere in all that quiet, steady giving, the world had simply forgotten to hold her in return. The night she curled up in the back seat of her 2009 Honda Accord, with a rolled jacket beneath her head and a wool blanket she had bought at a church rummage sale pulled across her legs, people who had known her for decades had no idea where she was. Her former colleagues assumed she had moved closer to family. Her neighbors had already introduced themselves to the couple who moved into the house on Birchwood Lane. Even Clifford, who had shared 22 years with her, had moved on with the efficiency of a man who had been planning his exit long before he announced it. But what none of them knew was that in losing everything she thought defined her, Eleanor Marsh was about to find something that had been waiting for her for 24 years. Something her grandmother had hidden in the earth beneath an old birch tree. Something that would change not just where she lived, but who she understood herself to be. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, if you believe in second chances and the quiet courage of starting over, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. It costs you nothing and it means more than you know. Now let us begin. There was a moment just before the world went quiet when Eleanor Marsh realized she had stopped counting the days. It had started as something she did deliberately, a small act of control in a life that had slipped entirely out of her hands. Day 1, day 12, day 31. She had marked them in the back of a small notebook she kept tucked beneath the driver's seat, not because she expected anyone to ask, but because she needed proof. Something tangible, something that said she was still here, still moving, still a person who kept track of things. By day 94, she had stopped writing. Not out of despair, not exactly. More like the way you stop checking the clock during a long drive through open country when the landscape takes over and time becomes something different, less urgent, less defined. She was still here. She knew that much. She just no longer needed the number to confirm it. It was the morning of what she would later calculate had been day 117 when the envelope appeared. She did not see it right away. She woke the way she always did in the car, carefully in stages, the way you surface from deep water without wanting to disturb anything. First, her eyes adjusting to the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the windshield. Then her body uncurling from the back seat where she had arranged herself with practiced efficiency, a rolled jacket beneath her head, a wool blanket pulled across her legs. Then her awareness spreading outward from the car's small interior to the world beyond the glass. The Walmart parking lot was already stirring, a delivery truck idling near the garden center, a woman in scrubs walking quickly toward a sedan 3 rows over. The particular silence of a place that never fully sleeps, but sometimes comes close. Ellie sat up slowly, pressed her palms against her lower back. 55 years old and sleeping in a car was not something her body accepted without commentary. She reached for the water bottle she kept on the floor of the passenger seat, took a careful sip, and looked through the windshield. The envelope was tucked beneath the left wiper blade pressed flat against the glass. White, plain, no stamp, no return address, just her name, Eleanor. Written in a hand she knew the way she knew her own face in a mirror, the slight lean of the E, the way the A in her name curved back on itself like a small question, the particular pressure of the pen that came through even in the ink's dried lines. Her grandmother's handwriting. Iris Marsh had been dead for 10 years. Ellie did not move for a long time. She sat with her hands wrapped around the water bottle, staring at the envelope through the glass, and told herself there was a reasonable explanation. There was always a reasonable explanation. Handwriting could be similar. People imitated styles without knowing it. Memory was an unreliable curator, softening edges, filling gaps with what you wanted to see rather than what was actually there. But her hands, when she finally opened the door and reached for the envelope, were not steady. She held it without opening it, turned it over. Nothing on the back. No seal, just the flap tucked in. She stood in the early morning air, the parking lot sounds distant and thin, and pressed the envelope between her palms, as if she could read what was inside without having to look. Then she carried it back to the car, sat in the passenger seat, and opened it. Inside was a single iron key, old the kind with a long, narrow shaft and a simple oval bow, the metal dark with age but not rusted, and beneath the key a small piece of paper folded once. She unfolded it. 7 words, Calder's Creek, Birch Hollow Road. It was always yours. No signature. She read it 3 times. Then she set it on the dashboard and looked out the windshield at nothing in particular for a very long time. The marriage had not ended with a fight. That was the part Ellie had never been able to explain properly to the few people she had told, and eventually stopped trying to explain at all. People expected a fight, a revelation, a moment of confrontation that could serve as the clean dividing line between before and after. They wanted a reason they could hold in their hands and examine something with edges sharp enough to justify the ruin that followed. What she had instead was a Tuesday evening in March, a kitchen lit by a single overhead light that had always buzzed faintly, a detail she had meant to fix for years and now would never need to. Clifford standing at the counter with his back to her, looking out the window at the backyard where nothing was happening. He had come home later than usual, which was itself no longer unusual, and he had set his briefcase down in the hallway with a care that felt deliberate, as if he were practicing something, preparing for a performance he had rehearsed many times in private. She had been grading papers at the kitchen table. 21 years of teaching had given her the ability to work through almost any household atmosphere. The low hum of a television in another room, the sound of rain on the windows, even the particular tension that had been building between them for longer than she wanted to admit, that specific gravity of a marriage in its final season present in every room but never quite named. Clifford's voice when it came was even, measured. The voice he used in depositions she had always thought the voice of a man who has decided what he is going to say and has arranged the words to prevent discussion rather than invite it. I've been speaking with a mediator. I think we should formalize things. She set her pen down. She waited for more, for an explanation, a reason, something she could hold on to, but none came. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the window, on the dark backyard, on whatever he saw out there that she apparently could not. There was no betrayal to point at, no single moment to blame, just a slow drifting apart that he had apparently finished navigating long before she realized they were lost. That was how 22 years ended, not with fire, with paperwork. In the weeks that followed, she discovered things she had not known about the architecture of their shared life. She had trusted Clifford with the practical arrangements because he was the one who understood them, or so she had believed. He was a lawyer. He knew how these things worked. She had signed documents over the years without reading them carefully, had deferred to his judgment on the structure of their accounts, the titling of the house, the arrangement of their finances. She had done this not out of carelessness, but out of a kind of trust that she understood now, sitting across from her own attorney in a small office that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee, had been misplaced in ways she could not undo. The house had always been in Clifford's name. The joint accounts were structured in ways her name appeared on paper, but her access was contingent on terms she had never read carefully enough to understand. Even the retirement contributions she thought they were building together had provisions she had not known were there until someone laid them out plainly in a room with fluorescent lighting and a box of tissues on the corner of the desk. By the time the divorce was finalized, the life they had built together had been itemized, categorized, and distributed according to legal language that left her with 2 bags of used Honda and the particular hollow knowledge of a person who had paid careful attention to everything that mattered and had somehow missed the thing that mattered most. She had considered calling her sister in Roanoke, had considered it many times sitting in the car in the dark, with her phone in her hand, finding the name in her contacts, her thumb hovering above it. But pride kept her from pressing it, and something deeper than pride, something harder to name. The sense that explaining her situation would require her to explain how she had arrived there, and that explanation required a kind of accounting she was not ready to do. All the small moments of deference, all the decisions she had made by not making them, all the years of shaping herself around someone else's preferences and calling it partnership and believing mostly that she was right to call it that. She was not ready to say those things out loud yet, so she stayed in the car. She found work at a diner 40 minutes away, enough to keep gas in the tank and food in the small cooler she kept in the trunk. She learned which parking lots were safest at night, which security guards made a point of looking the other way, which public restrooms stayed open late enough for her to wash her face in something resembling privacy. She maintained the appearance of a woman who was between situations rather than inside one with no visible edge. She wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, learned to press them smooth against the car's rear window on sunny mornings. She smiled at the diner customers with the particular warmth of a woman who had spent 2 decades making frightened children feel safe. And it worked because that warmth was not performance. It was simply who she was, even here, even now, even in a life she did not recognize. She had been a school teacher for 21 years, third grade, then fourth, then third again when the district reorganized. She had driven the same route to Millhaven Elementary every weekday morning for 2 decades through seasons that changed, and students who changed, and a building that grew older and shabbier and more beloved simultaneously. She had memorized which families were struggling, which children came to school hungry, which ones needed someone to stay a few minutes after the final bell. That kind of attention, the quiet, sustained kind, had been the core of her professional life. The thing she was most certain she was good at. The thing she had built her sense of herself around for as long as she could remember. It did not prepare her for being invisible. Because that was what she discovered in the parking lots and rest stops and quiet side streets where she spent her nights. Not danger, not the dramatic vulnerability she had braced for, but a particular kind of erasure. The world had a rhythm, and she was no longer part of it. People moved past her without registering her presence. She had slipped out of the ordinary current of things, and the current had simply closed behind her without a ripple, as if the space she had occupied had never quite been hers to begin with. Some nights she drove past her old neighborhood, slowing just enough to see the house on Birchwood Lane through the trees, its windows warm with light. It looked unchanged, untouched, as if her absence had been absorbed so completely it left no mark anywhere but inside her own chest. That was the detail that hollowed her out most completely. Not the loss itself, but how little space the loss seemed to occupy in the world outside her. She had thought about the students she had taught over the years on those nights, wondered where they were, wondered if any of them occasionally thought about the woman who had stayed beside them at a small reading table and refused to let them give up on something they had not yet found a way through. She liked to believe that somewhere in some life, she would never see the work she had done was still living, still being carried forward by someone who didn't know they were carrying it. That thought was what kept the stubborn thing inside her from going out entirely. Not hope exactly, more like the refusal to stop. The same quality that had made her stay after school with a child who couldn't yet read. Not because the job description required it, not because anyone was watching, but because she could not in good conscience leave a child alone with something they hadn't yet found a way through. She applied that same stubbornness to herself now. Woke up, did the next thing, and the thing after that. And then on day 117, the envelope appeared. The drive to Calder's Creek took just under 2 hours. She had looked the town up on her phone in the parking lot, still sitting in the passenger seat with the key on the dashboard and the note in her lap. It existed. It was real. A small community in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, population under 2,000, the kind of place that appeared on maps as a name rather than a dot, surrounded by landscape that had been there long before anyone thought to name it. She had not planned to go. She had told herself she was just looking it up. But by 8 in the morning, she had packed her cooler, rearranged her bags in the trunk with their usual precision, and pulled out of the parking lot heading southwest. She drove without the radio. She needed the quiet. The landscape shifted as she moved away from the city's outer sprawl. Strip malls thinning, trees growing closer to the road. The light changing in quality, taking on the particular clarity you only find in elevated country, where the air is thinner and cleaner and carries less of the accumulated weight of too many people living too close together. She lowered the window a few inches and let the air move through the car, cool and carrying something green underneath the chill. The key sat in the cup holder beside her. She found herself glancing at it at intervals, the way you check on something you are not yet sure you trust. Calder's Creek announced itself with a hand-painted wooden sign that someone had recently repainted the letters clean and deliberate against a dark green background. She drove through the center of town, slowly taking in each detail, the way you take in a place you might need to know well later. A post office with an American flag moving in a light mountain breeze. A hardware store with seed packets arranged in the front window. A coffee shop called the Birch Cup with 2 wooden rocking chairs on a narrow porch. A gas station. A white clapboard church with a modest spire and a marquee sign that read, "Every door is a new beginning." She read it twice. Then she continued out the other side of town, following the road toward Birch Hollow, watching for a left turn after a mailbox shaped like a covered bridge, which she found eventually half a mile past a grain store with a rusted tin roof and a hand-lettered sign advertising firewood by the cord. The road narrowed quickly, trees pressing in on both sides. White birches in particular, their bark pale against the darker pines, their leaves catching the morning light in a way that made the whole corridor seem lit from within, as if the trees themselves were the source of the light rather than the sun. She had always loved birch trees without being able to say precisely why. Something about the way they stood, distinct and visible, refusing to blend into the darker forest around them. The property appeared around a long, slow curve. She almost missed the drive. It was barely visible from the road, two tracks in the grass leading between birch trees, the opening marked by an old stone post on one side, with no corresponding post on the other, as if someone had started to formalize the entrance, and then decided formality wasn't the point. She pulled in slowly, the car bumping over uneven ground, and followed the tracks until the trees opened and the house came into view. It was small, a single story, board and batten siding weathered to a soft gray that looked not neglected, but settled the color of something that had made peace with its surroundings over many years. A covered porch across the front with two wooden steps, a window on each side of the door, a stone chimney along the right side, a roof that needed attention in one corner but was otherwise sound, the kind of sound that comes from good original construction rather than recent maintenance. It looked like a place that had been waiting patiently without making a fuss about it. Ellie sat in the car for a long moment. She looked at the house. The morning was quiet around it, only the sound of wind in the birch trees, and somewhere at the edge of hearing a creek moving steadily over stones. She picked up the key from the cup holder. She got out of the car. The air hit her immediately, cool and dense with pine and wet earth, and something underneath both of those, something older and quieter like stone that had absorbed decades of mountain weather and held the record of it without complaint. She stood for a moment just breathing it in. Then she walked to the porch. The steps held. The boards flexed slightly under her weight but did not give. She stood at the door with the iron key in her hand and felt the weight of the moment pressing against her, the way certain moments do before you fully understand what they are. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The click it made was soft and complete. The sound of something built to do exactly one thing, doing it without resistance, without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for this precise key in this precise hand and had been entirely patient about both for a very long time. She pushed the door open. The inside was dim, the curtains half drawn, and she stood in the doorway letting her eyes adjust. One main room, a kitchen along the back wall with a propane stove and an old farmhouse sink with a window above it looking out toward the birch trees. A round table with two chairs positioned to catch the light from the front windows. A reading chair near the window with a floor lamp beside it. A narrow staircase leading up to a sleeping loft. Rough-hewn shelves on one wall, mostly empty but not stripped bare. A stone fireplace on the opposite wall, clean and swept, with a box of long matches set at a precise angle on the mantel. Simple, complete, as if someone had thought carefully about what was necessary and removed everything else. And on the table at the center, a coffee mug. She crossed to it before she understood what she was doing, pressed her palm against the ceramic, still warm. She pulled her hand back, turned slowly, looking at the room with different eyes now. The front door she had come through was the only obvious entry. But along the back of the kitchen, half concealed behind the old refrigerator, there was a second door standing just slightly ajar, a thin line of outdoor light visible at its edge. She stood very still and listened. Birdsong outside, wind in the birches, the small ticking sounds a house makes when it is settling into the temperature of a new day. Nothing else. She crossed to the back door and pushed it fully open. A path led away through tall grass toward the tree line. Already still, already empty. Whoever had been here was gone. She could feel the absence of them, the way you sometimes feel a room where something has just ended. Not a presence, but the clear outline of one. The air still holding the shape of what had moved through it minutes before. Back inside, she stood in the center of the room and looked at everything around her again. The walls, the shelves, the simple furnishings. Everything old but cared for. The surfaces dusty in places but not neglected. There were small signs of someone having tended this place over time. The folded cloth near the sink, the matches set with precision, a hook by the front door, with nothing hanging on it, but installed with deliberate care, as if whoever put it there was anticipating a coat that had not yet arrived. Then her eye caught the mirror. It hung beside the fireplace, old and slightly foxed at the edges, The frame made of thin strips of birch wood, fitted together with a craftsman's patience. But it was not the mirror itself that stopped her. It was what she could see tucked behind the upper right corner of the frame, just barely visible, unless you were looking a folded piece of paper pressed between the wood and the wall, as if placed there deliberately, as if left for someone who would know to look. She crossed to it, reached up, worked the paper free with careful fingers. It was old. The edges had yellowed and the fold had the deep settled crease of paper that has been in one position for a very long time, years perhaps waiting exactly where it was placed. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. Not similar, not reminiscent. The actual hand, the same slight lean, the same careful pressure, the same way the lowercase r resolved into a shape that was almost musical, a detail so specific and so particular that she had never in her life seen it in anyone else's writing. She read, "For when you're ready to start over. Not the life you planned, the one you choose." Two more words beneath. "With love." No signature. She did not need one. Ellie stood in the small room with the note open in her hands and felt something shift inside her. Not dramatically, not with sound or motion. The quiet kind of shift, the kind that happens in the space between one breath and the next, when something that has been held too tightly is finally allowed to release. Her grandmother had written this, had folded it and pressed it behind this mirror in this house that the deed would later confirm had been Eleanor Marsh's property for 24 years without her knowing. Had done all of this carefully and quietly and without telling anyone who would have explained it before it could be discovered in exactly the way it needed to be. She pulled a chair from the table and sat down. For the first time in 4 months, she sat somewhere that did not require her to be ready to leave. No arithmetic running in the background about how long she could stay before someone noticed. No listening for footsteps or approaching headlights. Just a chair, a table, a room that was hers in ways she did not yet fully understand, but could feel beginning to become clear. The coffee mug sat in front of her. She pressed both hands around it, still faintly warm, the last of the warmth fading but not yet gone. She sat like that for a long time, while the morning continued arriving through the windows and the birch trees moved in their steady, unhurried way outside, and somewhere nearby the creek kept moving over its stones as it had been doing before she arrived, and would go on doing long after, indifferent to her presence in the best possible way. She did not cry. She did not feel the need to. What she felt was harder to name and more lasting than tears. Like a traveler who has been walking a very long way and has just without entirely expecting it come to the place they were walking toward. She stayed. The first night was not what she had braced for. She had expected to feel like a trespasser, had expected the low-grade vigilance that had become her constant companion over 4 months, the part of her that stayed half awake, even in sleep, listening for the wrong kind of footstep, the wrong kind of light. Instead, she slept deeply and without interruption in the loft above the main room. Under a wool blanket, she found folded on a shelf, the ceiling low and close above her, in a way that felt like shelter rather than confinement. She woke to light coming through the single loft window and lying in a pale rectangle across the floor. And for a few seconds, she did not know where she was, the body still reaching for its old alertness, bracing for the hard edges of the car. Then it came back. The house, the key, the note. She exhaled in a way she had not exhaled in a very long time. Long and slow and from somewhere deep, as if something inside her that had been contracted for months was being cautiously allowed to open. She lay still and listened to the morning sounds of the house, the particular silence of a place where the quiet is genuine rather than imposed. Outside, a bird she couldn't name was singing in the birch trees, the sound coming in clear and unhurried through the old window frame, as if it had been sent specifically for this particular morning. She stayed another day, and the day after that. Each morning she told herself this was temporary. Each evening she found a reason to stay just a little longer. She cleaned without deciding to wipe down surfaces, swept the front porch, opened windows and let the mountain air move through the rooms, as if the house itself had been waiting to breathe again after a long stillness. She found that the propane stove worked reliably on all but the back right burner, which ran hot and required watching. She found that the reading chair by the front window caught the afternoon light at an angle that was precisely right for a person who needed to sit and think without being required to do anything else. She found on one of the rough-hewn shelves a small collection of seed packets. Dried but carefully labeled in handwriting she did not recognize, basil and thyme and rosemary and a variety of tomatoes she had never heard of. Someone had intended a garden. Someone had saved these with a specific future in mind and had not been there to see it through. She set them on the windowsill where the light could reach them and left them there, not yet ready to decide what they meant. On the fourth morning, she walked the full perimeter of the property for the first time and discovered it was larger than it appeared from the road. Past the cleared area around the house, the land sloped gently toward the tree line, the grass giving way to rougher ground, and then to a stand of mature trees, birches, mostly their trunks thick with decades. She walked the edge of the property slowly, her hands in her jacket pockets, the iron key there alongside her fingers, its familiar weight keeping her anchored to something solid, while everything else was still finding its shape. And when she came back to the house and climbed the porch steps and unlocked the door with the key that fit perfectly every single time without any coaxing or adjustment, she understood something she had not yet put into words. She was not here by accident. Whatever forces had arranged this, whatever careful and patient work her grandmother had done, in the years before she died, whatever chain of events had delivered the envelope to a car window in a Walmart parking lot on exactly the morning it needed to arrive, none of it was random. None of it was coincidence. She had been pointed here by the woman who had known her longest and loved her most clearly, who had anticipated something Ellie herself had not known was coming, and who had made provision for it quietly and without drama, the way Iris Marsh had always done everything that truly mattered. She made tea on the propane stove, watched the back burner carefully, and drank it standing at the farmhouse sink, looking out through the window at the birch trees moving in the morning breeze. Tomorrow she would drive into Calder's Creek and find out who she was in this new place. Tonight she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Birch Cup opened at 6:30 in the morning, which Ellie discovered by arriving at 6:15 and sitting in one of the porch rocking chairs until a woman with silver-streaked hair and flour already on her apron unlocked the front door from the inside, without appearing the least bit surprised to find someone waiting. The woman's name was Dora Phelps. She had owned the coffee shop for 11 years, she said, and before that her mother had owned it for 23. And before that it had been a feed store, which explained the high ceilings and the wide plank floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot in the particular way of old wood that has absorbed decades of foot traffic and made peace with all of it. She offered this information in the time it took her to start the first pot of coffee, the words coming out in an easy, unhurried stream, the way people talk in places where silence is comfortable enough that filling it is a choice rather than a necessity. Ellie sat at the counter and wrapped her hands around the mug Dora set in front of her and felt the warmth rise through her palms. She had not planned to say anything about the house. She had come for coffee and perhaps information about the town, the practical, surface-level geography of a place she was still learning to be inside. But Dora had the particular quality of certain people in small communities, a kind of steady, undemanding presence that made you feel you could say a thing without it being cataloged and used against you later. And by the second cup, Ellie had said more than she intended. Not everything. Not the car, not the 4 months, not the specific texture of what it felt like to lose a life by degrees and then all at once. But the house on Birch Hollow Road, the key, the drive from the city, the note behind the mirror. Dora listened without interrupting, refilled the mug without being asked. When Ellie finished, Dora was quiet for a moment, holding the coffee pot and looking at it rather than at Ellie, in the way of someone who is deciding how much of what they know belongs to them to give away. Then she set the pot down and said something that made the back of Ellie's neck go still. You'll want to talk to Hattie Drummond. Not you might want to. Not there's a woman who knew that property. You'll want to. As if it were already decided. As if it were simply the next thing in a sequence that had been in motion for longer than this conversation. Ellie looked up. Dora met her eyes, and there was something in her expression that was careful without being evasive, the look of someone who holds a piece of a larger story and understands that it is not entirely theirs to tell. She lives on Sycamore Hollow, Dora said. About a mile and a half out, White House green door rooster weather vane on the barn. You can't miss it, but I'll tell you this now so you're not caught off guard. A small pause. She'll have seen you coming before you get to the gate. Ellie considered this for a moment. How did you know my name? She asked. I didn't say it. Dora smiled. It was a small smile, not mysterious exactly, but layered in the way of a person who has kept a confidence for a long time and is close to the end of the keeping. Hattie, she said simply and turned back to her work. Hattie Drummond was 78 years old, which Ellie calculated not from anything Hattie said about herself, but from the evidence of the life assembled around her. The house was small and precise, the precision not of fussiness, but of someone who has spent decades learning exactly what they need and quietly removing everything else. The garden was orderly in the way wild things become orderly when someone with real patience tends them long enough to understand their nature. Lavender along the front path, still holding its color in the cool October air. A kitchen garden behind a low fence, the beds productive and well managed. A porch with a single chair positioned to face the road, and in that chair when Ellie pulled her car to a stop on the gravel Hattie Drummond. She was looking at Ellie before the engine was fully off. Not with surprise, with recognition. Ellie got out slowly, walked to the gate. The woman in the chair was small and angular with white hair cut close to her head and eyes the color of creek water in shade a clear gray-green that was direct and entirely uninterested in pretending to be anything other than what it was. She had a woven blanket across her lap and both hands folded over it, comfortable and still, like someone who has learned that patience is not a passive quality, but an active practice. Hattie's voice when she spoke first was dry and direct and not unkind. I wondered how long it would take you to find your way here. Ellie stopped at the gate. You know who I am. Eleanor Marsh, Iris's granddaughter. A pause, brief and considering. You have her chin, the stubborn set of it. Ellie opened the gate and came up the path and sat in the second chair, which she noticed now had been positioned at an angle toward the first, the way furniture gets arranged when company is expected rather than merely hoped for. They were quiet for a moment in a silence that had no discomfort in it. Tell me about the house, Ellie said. And Hattie did. Not in order and not all at once. The way certain people tell stories, letting the shape emerge gradually rather than presenting it finished and explained. But the core of it came through clearly, and Ellie sat still and listened without interrupting, because she understood that the shape of the telling mattered as much as the information itself. Iris Marsh had owned the property on Birch Hollow Road for over 30 years. She had come to Calder's Creek originally to care for an elderly cousin who had no one else stayed after the cousin passed because the place had gotten into her in the way certain places do when you arrive at exactly the right season of your life to receive them fully. She had lived there part-time at first, then increasingly as the years settled her further into herself, she had stayed through everything. She had been a particular kind of woman, Hattie said, using the word the way you use it when you mean singular. Someone who made a deep impression without trying to, who was remembered not for what she said, but for how it felt to be seen by her. She talked about you, Hattie said. Not constantly. More like she would say something occasionally and it would stay. The way certain things stay. Ellie looked out at the lavender along the path. She never told me about the house. No. Hattie was quiet for a moment, looking at her folded hands. She wouldn't have. Why not? Hattie lifted her eyes. Because she wanted it to be yours without conditions attached. If she'd told you about it while you were married, it would have become part of that world, part of the calculations and the negotiations. She wanted it to exist outside of all that, something that couldn't be factored into anyone else's arrangements. The morning was warming slightly, the Blue Ridge sun coming over the ridge and laying long shadows across Hattie's garden. Ellie thought about a woman making a decision in 2001, in the first year of a marriage she apparently had concerns about, to quietly transfer a piece of property into her granddaughter's name, and then say nothing. To simply let it exist. To trust that it would be there when it was needed. She was that certain, Ellie said, that I would need it someday. Hattie considered her answer before giving it in the deliberate way of someone who has learned that honesty and precision are not always the same thing. She wasn't certain, Hattie said finally. She was prepared. There's a difference. Iris prepared for the things she hoped would never happen, and she did it thoroughly and without making it anyone's burden, including yours. Ellie stayed 2 hours that first morning. She came back 3 days later in the time after that. Hattie never formally invited her and never turned her away. She simply made tea and sat in her chair and talked when she had something to say and was quiet when she didn't. And Ellie found that rhythm to be one of the most comfortable she had encountered in longer than she could remember. She also found gradually that Hattie had known Iris not in the way of close neighbors who see each other in passing, but in the way of women who have known each other long enough to hold each other's silences as well as their words. She also found work. Dora had mentioned on Ellie's third visit to the Birch Cup that she lost her weekend help every fall when the young people went back to their lives elsewhere. And she had looked at Ellie with the directness of a woman who has learned to ask for what she needs without performing the asking. Ellie had started the following Saturday. She was not a natural waitress in the way of someone trained to the work. She moved too deliberately, thought too carefully before each action arrived at each table, with the focused attention she had once given to children who needed help rather than the fluid efficiency of someone who has done this for years. But she was patient with people, and she listened well, and in a small-town coffee shop, those qualities turned out to matter considerably more than speed. She learned the regulars. Gerald Whitmore, who took his coffee with exactly one sugar and would sit with an untouched cup rather than remind you if you forgot. Norma and Bet, best friends for 51 years, who came in every Sunday after church and still made each other laugh until they had to set their cups down and wait for it to pass. A man named August, who sat at the corner table every Thursday with the same worn paperback and never ordered anything but black coffee and whatever pie was left from the day before. And she learned something else, that Calder's Creek knew things without being told them directly. Not through gossip, not in the careless, damaging way of communities that use other people's stories as entertainment, but in the way of people who have lived alongside each other long enough that information moves through the shared fabric of the place through means that are difficult to name but impossible to miss. They knew she was staying at the Iris Marsh property. They knew something about her circumstances in the tactful, unspoken way that small communities understand things they have collectively decided not to press on. They were warm without being intrusive, welcoming without requiring explanation. It was on her fourth day walking the property that she found the box. She had taken to making a slow circuit of the land each morning before anything else, a habit that had begun practically and had become something else, a way of beginning each day in contact with ground rather than thought. The property was larger than it appeared from the road. Past the house and its immediate clearing, the land sloped downward through rougher ground toward a stand of mature trees. Birches, mostly their trunks thick with decades in the way that only time can produce. There was one tree in particular, the largest of them, its roots breaking the ground surface in wide arcs before disappearing back into the earth. She had noticed it on the first walk and noticed it again on the second. On the fourth morning, she stopped and crouched and looked at the ground near its base more carefully. The earth was uneven in a way not entirely explained by the root system. A section roughly the size of a large book was slightly raised, the grass growing differently over it, shorter and less established like ground that had been disturbed and resettled not too many years ago and had not yet fully returned to the texture of the undisturbed ground around it. She found a flat stone near the tree line and used it to dig. The box was not deep, 8 inches perhaps, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job well despite the seasons. She lifted it out and carried it back to the house and set it on the table and stood looking at it the way you stand before something you understand to be important before you have any information about why. Then she sat down and opened it. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of cloth, were documents. Legal papers neatly folded, their edges crisp despite the years. She unfolded them carefully and read them once, then again, then a third time, making certain she was reading what she thought she was reading. A deed of transfer. The property at Birch Hollow Road, Calder's Creek, Virginia. Transferred from Iris Catherine Marsh to Eleanor Ruth Marsh. The date was from 2001, the year she and Clifford had married. Ellie sat with the papers in her hands and let the information find its level inside her. The way water finds its level, not quickly or dramatically, but with the patient inevitability of something that obeys its own laws, regardless of what you think about it. Her grandmother had signed this house over to her within the first year of her marriage to Clifford Marsh. Had done it quietly without telling her, without telling anyone as far as she could determine. Had filed the paperwork and buried the evidence in a metal box beneath the oldest birch tree on the property and had said nothing. For 24 years. She reached into the box again. There was one more thing. An envelope smaller than the one that had been left on her windshield. Sealed with red wax pressed with what appeared to be a small floral stamp. A sprig of rosemary, the impression clear and deliberate in the wax. On the front in Iris's handwriting, 4 words. Only when you truly need it. She held the envelope for a long time. Then she set it carefully beside the deed and looked at both of them in the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. The deed with its legal language and its 24-year-old date. The envelope with its red wax seal and its 4 words written by a woman who had understood somehow that there would be a right time and a wrong time, and that Eleanor would know the difference when the difference arrived. She was not ready to open it. She left it on the table and went outside and walked all the way to the old birch tree and stood beside it for a while, her hand on the bark, which was cool and textured and entirely indifferent to what she had just found, which was exactly what she needed it to be. Hattie came the next afternoon. She arrived with a tin of shortbread and no announcement, walking up the drive with the deliberate pace of someone whose hip was giving her trouble, but who had made a private decision not to accommodate it. They sat on the porch with tea, and for a while they talked about small things. The propane stove's temperamental back burner, which Hattie confirmed had always run hot. The rosemary along the border, which Hattie said Iris had planted in her first year here because she said it kept her honest about what season she was in. Then Ellie said, "I found the box." Hattie nodded slowly, the nod of someone noting the arrival of something expected. "She filed it properly," Hattie said. "It's been legal since 2001, recorded at the county, everything in order." "Did you know about it from the beginning?" A pause, short but genuine. "Iris told me when she did it. She asked me to say nothing unless it became necessary." Hattie picked up her tea. She was a woman who thought ahead, farther ahead than most people are comfortable thinking. "She should have told me herself," Ellie said. Not with bitterness, with the clean accuracy of something simply true. "Yes," Hattie said without argument and without defense, just the word given plainly. They sat with that between them. Then Ellie said, "Hattie, tell me about Clifford coming here." The silence this time was different, longer and heavier. Then Hattie told her. Clifford Marsh had come to Calder's Creek 14 months ago, had driven up Birch Hollow Road and knocked on the door of the small house which Hattie had been tending as she had tended it for years. She had answered the door, and he had introduced himself with a formality that she recognized immediately as the formality of someone who uses courtesy as an instrument rather than an expression. Polished and precise and entirely purposeful. He had explained that he believed there might be documentation associated with the property that had not been properly accounted for during certain legal proceedings, and that he was hoping to clarify the situation. Hattie had told him she was the neighbor, that the house was not her property to discuss, and that any legal questions were most appropriately addressed through the county recorder's office or through counsel. He had stood on the porch and looked past her into the house for a moment, the brief assessing look of a man calculating what he is looking at and what it might still be worth. Then he had thanked her with the same polished courtesy and left. Hattie had called Thomas Greer in Charlottesville the same afternoon. "Thomas Greer," Ellie said. "Iris's attorney. He handled the estate and the deed transfer both. He's been trying to reach you. Your contact information had changed." Hattie reached into her coat pocket and produced a business card worn at the corners from being carried for some time and set it on the table between them. "He's the one who sent the envelope." Ellie looked at the card. The handwriting on it. That was Iris's handwriting. Thomas had letters of hers on file. He thought it might reach you differently if it arrived looking familiar rather than official. A pause. "We thought you might need something that felt like her." Ellie picked up the card, turned it over. She thought about standing in a Walmart parking lot in the gray hour before dawn, holding an envelope with her grandmother's handwriting on it, feeling the world tilt on its axis. She thought about what she would have done if it had arrived as a certified letter from a law office, whether she would have opened it, whether she would have gotten in the car. "And the coffee mug," she said. "Still warm when I got here." Hattie met her eyes without apology. "I wanted the house to be ready," she said. "I didn't expect you quite so early. I came through the back when I heard your car on the road." Something moved through Ellie, then complex and warm and sharp all at once. She stood and walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the birch trees at the road beyond them. Clifford had known, had come to this place, stood on this porch, looked into this house that had been hers for 24 years without her knowledge, and had attempted in his careful, methodical way to assess what might still be taken. She waited for the anger to rise into something louder. It didn't. It stayed at a particular register, steady and contained, and underneath it was something she had not anticipated. A grief not for what she had lost, but for what she had not known she had. All those years this house had existed in these mountains, while she moved through her life without knowing it was here. She turned back. "She should have told me," she said again simply. "Yes," Hattie said again, simply. Then Ellie went inside and stood in the center of the house. She moved the sealed envelope from the table to the shelf beside the fireplace, where it could rest somewhere more permanent, somewhere that communicated intention rather than indecision. She went out the back door through the long grass all the way to the old birch tree. She knelt in the grass beside the place where the box had been, and she began with her hands to pull the weeds that had grown up around the base of the tree. Not thinking about Clifford, not constructing arguments, not rehearsing things she would never say, just doing the immediate work of the ground in front of her. The light changed as she worked. The afternoon gold came through the birch leaves in long slanted bars, and the air smelled of turned earth and the clean, particular sharpness of a mountain evening beginning to arrive. She sat back on her heels and looked at the cleared ground around the tree. Better. She went inside, washed her hands at the farmhouse sink, and put the kettle on. She stood at the kitchen window while the kettle worked, watching the last of the light leave the birch trees slowly. The way light leaves things it has held all day, the final gold remaining longest in the very tops of the tallest trees before the dusk finally came for it. She was still here. She intended to stay. October came to Calder's Creek the way it comes to mountain country, not gradually but decisively, as if the hills had made a collective agreement overnight. One morning the birch trees were still holding their summer green. The next they were gold, and the gold was so complete and so sudden that Ellie stood on the porch with her coffee and simply looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something that catches you unprepared with its beauty. She had been here 6 weeks. The bags were still in the trunk of her car. She had not unpacked them formally, had not said the word home aloud in connection with this place. But she had stopped telling herself she was leaving soon. And that stopping was its own kind of decision. The quiet kind. The kind that happens before you are ready to announce it even to yourself. The garden had been her first real project. Not the kitchen beds, those would wait for spring. But the borders immediately around the house, overgrown and gone to rough woody stems, the persistent gray-green stalks of something that had once been deliberate planting and had survived years of unattended winters through sheer stubbornness. She had asked Hattie about it on one of their porch afternoons. Hattie had not hesitated. "Rosemary," she said. "Iris planted it the first year she was here. Said it was the one thing she absolutely could not do without. Said it kept her honest about what season she was in." Ellie had gone back to the property and looked at the overgrown borders differently after that. Not as neglect to be corrected, but as survival to be honored. She cut it back carefully, coaxing rather than forcing, and within 2 weeks the new growth was already visible at the base of the old stems, small and green and entirely certain of itself. In the 3rd week of October, she drove to Charlottesville to meet Thomas Greer. He was a quiet man in his late 60s with a careful way of speaking that came not from hesitation, but from the habit of precision. The habit of a person who has spent a career understanding that the exact word matters and the approximate one can do real damage. His office was full of file boxes and had a window looking out onto a small courtyard where a single maple was making the most of its October. He had Iris's original documents, the full deed transfer, with its recording stamps and its 2001 date, and he walked her through each page without hurrying. He had also received, he told her, a letter from Clifford Marsh's attorney 14 months ago, inquiring about the property's status. He had responded that the matter was not one he could discuss with parties other than the named beneficiary, and had heard nothing further. He had then, in accordance with instructions Iris had left at the time of the original transfer, begun the process of locating Eleanor Marsh. "Your grandmother was very specific," Thomas said, opening a folder and sliding a handwritten page across the desk. "If 10 years passed from the date of her death without you coming to claim the property, I was to find you and make sure you knew." Ellie looked at the page. Iris's handwriting. Clear and familiar even here, even after everything. "It had been 10 years, she said. "It had been 10 years, Thomas confirmed quietly. "And then some." She drove back to Calder's Creek on the 2-lane mountain road with the windows down and the October air moving through the car cold and carrying wood smoke from somewhere in the hills. She had anticipated something louder in herself, some version of vindication or righteous anger. What she felt instead was simpler, solid, like ground that has been tested and found to hold. She continued building her life in Calder's Creek in the way that lives are actually built, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, consistent actions, repeated until they constitute a pattern, and the pattern begins to constitute a self, and the self begins to feel like something you chose rather than something that simply happened to you. She worked at the Birch Cup on weekends. She tended the rosemary. She stacked wood for winter with the help of a neighbor named Price, who appeared one Saturday with a splitter in 3 hours of time and no explanation beyond a nod toward the woodpile that communicated he had noticed it needed doing. She bought a second reading lamp for the loft. She found at a church sale a set of curtains in a deep rust color that looked as though they had been made for the windows of the main room, and she hung them herself with a level and too many trips up and down the stepladder and a satisfaction at the end entirely disproportionate to the task. She called her sister in Roanoke on a Wednesday evening in late October and told her the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Where she was, what she had found, that she was all right. Her sister listened and then said, working not to cry, "Mom always said Grandma Iris was the smartest woman she ever knew." Ellie sat on the porch after that call and watched the last of the October light leave the birch trees and thought about her grandmother planting rosemary. In the first year she had this property, saying it kept her honest about what season she was in. She thought she understood now exactly what Iris had meant. It was in the second week of November that Ruth Caldwell appeared. Ellie was on the porch in the late afternoon, a cup of tea going cold beside her, working through paperwork Thomas had sent when she heard a car slow on the road and stop. Not pull into the drive, just stop on the verge, the engine running, the hazard lights beginning their slow amber blink. She looked up. After a moment, the driver's door opened and a woman got out, looked at the front of the car and pressed both palms flat on the roof in the posture of someone receiving bad news they are going to have to manage on their own. Ellie set her papers down and walked to the end of the drive. The woman was perhaps 40, dark-haired, dressed in clothing appropriate for a city and insufficient for a Virginia mountain roadside in November. She was looking at her front tire, which was flat with the finality of a blowout rather than the gentler failure of a slow leak. She looked up when she heard Ellie's footsteps on the gravel. What Ellie saw in her face she recognized, not from having watched it in other people, from having worn it herself. The specific combination of exhaustion and the concentrated effort to appear less exhausted than you are. The expression of someone operating on the last thin margin of composure and working very hard to keep that from being visible. "I'm sorry," the woman said immediately. "I don't want to be a bother. I just need to figure out where the nearest service station is." 4 miles, Ellie said, "and they close at 5. The woman looked at her phone, looked at the tire, looked at her phone again. "It's 4:48, Ellie said. The woman exhaled, short and contained. "I have a spare," she said. "I've just never actually changed one." "I have," Ellie said. "Come up to the porch and I'll get my jacket. We'll sort it out." Her name was Ruth Caldwell. She offered this while Ellie worked the lug nuts loose in the cold November air, crouched beside the front wheel with the efficiency of someone who has learned practical skills out of necessity and has stopped being embarrassed about how or when she learned them. Ruth stood nearby holding the flashlight, and she talked in the careful economy of someone who has edited her story down to what is strictly necessary. She was driving from Richmond toward a town called Birdsong, where she had a cousin she had not spoken to in several years. She said this in the particular way of a person who has a reason for going somewhere, but has not yet decided how much of the reason to share. Ellie did not ask questions. When the tire was changed, she stood and looked at Ruth in the fading light, at the careful arrangement of her expression, at the specific quality of her tiredness, which was not the tiredness of a single long day, but of many long days accumulated into a background condition. "Come inside," Ellie said. "It's nearly dark and you need to eat before you drive any further." Ruth began to say she was fine. "It's not a question," Ellie said not unkindly, just clearly. They ate soup at the small round table while the wood stove worked at the chill in the room, and Ruth thawed in the way people thaw in warm spaces, when they have been cold longer than they have admitted. She talked in gradual increments. She was between things, between a job she had left and one she hadn't found yet, between an apartment she had given up and an arrangement she hadn't made, between one version of her life and whatever came after it. Ellie recognized every landmark of that terrain. She refilled Ruth's tea without asking. She did not offer advice or reassurance. She simply sat in the warm room and listened, and let the wood stove do its work, and let the house do what it had been built to do, which was hold people inside it while they figured out what came next. At some point, Ruth looked around the room, at the stone fireplace and the birch frame mirror, and the rust-colored curtains and the shelf beside the fireplace, with its sealed envelope and its iron key. Something in her expression shifted in the way of a person who encounters a space that answers something they didn't know they were asking. "You live here alone," she said. "Yes." Ruth nodded slowly. "It's a good house," she said. The way she said it contained more than 4 words could technically hold. Then she looked at Ellie more carefully. The specific focus of someone trying to place a face that is almost but not quite resolving into recognition. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. "This is strange. But have we met before? You look familiar." "Where did you grow up?" Ellie asked. "Millhaven, small town east of here." Ellie set her cup down. Millhaven. The same drive every morning for 21 years. The attendance sheets she had learned each September. The faces that came back to her now in flashes, partial and vivid. "What year were you in 3rd grade?" Ellie asked. Ruth blinked. 92, maybe 93? "Millhaven Elementary," Ellie said quietly. "Mrs. Marsh's class." The silence that followed had weight and temperature. Ruth stared at her. Something behind her eyes shifted the way things shift when a door opens in the deep architecture of memory, a door you had forgotten was there, and the light from behind it is older and stranger than anything in the room you are currently sitting in. "Oh," Ruth said. It was barely a word, more like the sound a person makes when something that has been traveling a very long time finally arrives. Ellie remembered her then, not instantly but in pieces the way memory retrieves things from far back. A small girl with dark braids who had come to school in the first weeks with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that drawing attention is not reliably safe, who had struggled with reading not from any lack of ability, but from the absence of anyone at home with the time or the patience to practice with her, who had sat in the back of the room and watched everything with careful, assessing eyes. Ellie had stayed after school with her 3 days a week for an entire semester, had sat beside her at the small reading table near the window and gone through the leveled book slowly page by page, without performance and without pressure. Just the two of them, and the late afternoon light, and the words on the page becoming gradually something Ruth could move through with confidence, and then eventually with something approaching love. "You stayed with me," Ruth said. Her voice was quiet and careful in the way of someone touching something fragile. "After school, all that year." "Yes. I moved districts the next year. I always wanted to tell you that it mattered." She stopped. "I didn't know how to find you. And then enough time passed that it felt strange to try." Ellie leaned forward and put her hand briefly over Ruth's on the table. A teacher's gesture, precise and warm and offering exactly enough. "You don't need to," Ellie said. They sat in the quiet of that for a while. Outside, the November wind had found the birch trees moving through their bare branches in a sound like something breathing steady and low coming through the old walls of the house, with the familiarity of something that had always belonged there. After a long while, Ellie stood and walked to the shelf beside the fireplace. She picked up the sealed envelope, the red wax unbroken, the rosemary impression clear and precise in its center. She carried it back to the table and sat down. She looked at it. Ruth watched her without speaking, understanding, without being told that something was happening that required a particular kind of presence, the kind that does not announce itself or demand anything in return. Ellie broke the seal. The wax cracked with a small, clean sound, like a quiet agreement between two things that had been waiting a long time to meet. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was Iris's, but different from the other notes. Slower, more deliberate. The hand of someone writing with full attention, choosing every word with the care of someone who understands they will not get another chance at this particular letter. She read it to herself first. Then she read it again. Then she read it aloud because the room and the moment and the woman sitting across from her seemed to require it, and because some things need to be spoken to become fully real. Her voice was steady. "My Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the time has come for you to know what I should perhaps have told you differently and in a different time. The house on Birch Hollow Road was mine for 32 years. I found it in the hardest year of my life, after your grandfather died, and I did not know for a while how to continue being a person without him beside me. I was wrong to think I couldn't. I learned that I could. I learned it slowly in that house one morning at a time, planting things and tending them, and watching the birch trees do what birch trees do, which is stand quietly and keep growing regardless of what the season requires of them. I signed that house over to you in the first year of your marriage because I saw something in the way Clifford arranged things, and I wanted you to have something that existed outside of his arrangements. Something of your own. Something that could wait for you as long as you needed it to wait. I am sorry I did not find the words to tell you while I was still here to explain them. I thought I had more time. We always think we have more time. That is perhaps the most human thing about us. What I know is this: you are more capable than you have been permitted to know. The life ahead of you is not a diminished version of the one behind you. It is something else entirely, something you will build piece by piece with your own hands and your own choosing the way all things worth having are built. I love you without condition or reservation. I always did. Come home when you are ready. It will be here. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Ruth had not moved. She was looking at Ellie with the steady attention of someone who understands that the most valuable thing they can offer right now is simply to be present without requiring anything. Ellie folded the letter along its original creases, held it in both hands. The wood stove settled with a small compression, a soft release. She had not known grief could feel like this. Not like the sharp, particular absence of something taken, but like finding unexpectedly a room in a house you thought you knew completely. Walking in and seeing that everything inside it has been arranged with love and has been waiting there undisturbed and patient for longer than you knew to look for it. Her grandmother had seen, had acted, had trusted the house to hold what she couldn't say directly, and had trusted Eleanor to find her way to it when the finding was necessary. And she had been right on both counts. She looked up at Ruth. "Stay tonight," she said. "The road is dark and birdsong isn't going anywhere." Ruth nodded. Once, that was enough. Later, after Ruth had been shown the loft and the extra blanket on the shelf, after the house had gone quiet, with the particular quality of a place being used for its intended purpose, Ellie put on her jacket and went out to the porch. The November night was cold and absolute. The Blue Ridge cold that holds nothing back, that arrives with the full authority of the season and does not apologize for it. The sky above the tree line was crowded with stars, more than she had ever seen in the city, more than she had remembered were possible, as if the dark had been waiting for her to be somewhere quiet enough to look up. She stood on the porch and turned the iron key over between her fingers. Its weight, its shape, the particular solidity of something made to do exactly one thing and made without compromise. She thought about Iris standing on these same boards in the years after her grandfather died, learning piece by piece the particular art of continuing. She thought about the rosemary that had survived 10 unattended winters and was already putting out new growth. She thought about Ruth asleep in the loft above her, dark-haired and exhausted, and between things carrying something heavy that she had not yet found a place to set down. She thought about a third-grade classroom in Millhaven, a small reading table near the window, a child with careful eyes who needed someone to stay. She went inside. From the row of hooks beside the door, she took the spare key she had cut in town the previous week, intending to give it to Hattie. She had not gotten around to it, and now understood that she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting, the way you sometimes wait for the right recipient of a thing without being able to name them in advance. She went to the foot of the loft stairs. "Ruth," she said quietly. A pause. Movement. Then Ruth appeared at the top of the stairs, still dressed, her eyes clear and present in the low amber light. Ellie held up the key. "The room at the back of the house," she said. "It has its own entrance off the kitchen. Small, but it's a proper space. The heat works. The window looks out at the old birch tree." A pause. "Stay as long as you need to." Ruth came down 2 steps, looked at the key in Ellie's hand. Something moved across her face. Then something complex and genuine and difficult to hold still long enough to name. The expression of someone who has been running on empty long enough that being offered something without conditions attached is almost harder to receive than nothing, because it requires you to believe, truly believe, that you deserve it. She came the rest of the way down the stairs and took the key. She did not say thank you. She didn't need to. There are moments when the word for a thing is smaller than the thing itself, and both people present understand that the word would diminish rather than honor what just passed between them. She closed her hand around it and went back upstairs. Ellie stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment in the quiet house. Then she went to the shelf beside the fireplace and placed Iris's letter there, open, now unfolded in the place where the sealed envelope had stood for weeks. No longer waiting to be read, no longer holding its breath. She looked at her own face in the foxed and aged mirror. tired in ways she was still working through, but present, here, in a house that had been hers for 24 years, without her knowing it, in a town that had received her without requiring explanation, in a life that bore no resemblance to the one she had planned, and every resemblance to the one she was choosing. The iron key she placed on the shelf beside the letter, not in her pocket anymore, not carried as a talisman against the fear of having nothing, set down somewhere solid, somewhere it could rest, because she no longer needed to hold on to it to believe in what it had opened. She turned off the kitchen light. The wood stove cast the room in low amber, the light reaching the walls and the ceiling, and the old mirror and the shelf with its letter and its key, and all the things she was still in the process of understanding. She stood in the center of it for a moment, the way you stand in a room you have come to love, not doing anything particular, just being inside it with full attention, letting it be exactly what it is. Outside, the birch trees stood in the dark and the cold, pale and patient against the starred November sky, doing what birch trees do, standing quietly, keeping growing. She went to bed. If this story reached something in you tonight, if it reminded you that it is never too late to find your way back to yourself, please leave a comment below and tell us what it meant to you. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this, share it with them. That is how these stories travel. That is how they do their work. Thank you for being here. Sleep well.